peaceful place. As the current circumstances surrounding the Indo-Pacific make the AOIP even more relevant, Japan pledges to work closely with ASEAN to propel a cooperation that will contribute to the principles stipulated in the AOIP. Ladies and gentlemen, the year 2023 marks the golden jubilee of the Japan-ASEAN Friendship and Cooperation. I can confidently say that Japan has stood and will continue to stand firmly by ASEAN as an equal partner, and our partnership will reinforce even more in the years to come. I hope that this webinar will serve as a good opportunity for all of us, including myself, to learn some key aspects of our cooperation. It will also shed light on how Japan and ASEAN should.
Okay, thank you, Your Excellency, Ambassador Akira Chiba, for your opening remarks from the side of Japan. Next, we would like to give the floor to Professor Dr. Firman Nur, Head of Research Center for Politics, Indonesian Institute of Sciences. For Professor Firman Nur, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Akbar. His Excellencies Akira Chiba, Ambassador Mission to Japan, of Japan to ASEAN, the Deputy of Social Science and Humanities, Indonesia Institute of Science, Professor Dr. Tri Nuke Pujastuti, distinguished speakers, Professor Dr. Takahara Akio, and Nanto Srianto, my fellow researchers, colleagues, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon. As we know, the world nowadays needs more cooperation and collaboration than ever to solve problems in the various fields. A variety of crises from small scale to a very serious one can be resolved by support from and cooperation with related stakeholders. Humanity crisis in all of its dimension caused by the COVID-19 pandemic teach us a lesson on the importance of cooperation. It is proven to reduce a heavy burden bore by a troubled country or a region. With the spirit of cooperation and collaboration, the relation between ASEAN and Japan definitely needs to be strengthened. Both ASEAN and Japan play a significant role in the region, in the economic, social, and humanity and security aspects. ASEAN has been playing an important role in ensuring stability, security, and prosperity in the region. This role can be magnified by involving other actors in the region, such as Japan. In this case, Japan has contributed a lot in the form of ideas and activities. On the other hand, Japan needs compatible and reliable partners to fulfill its interests at the international level. ASEAN, as a strategic organization, has been showing a welcoming position and offer mutual support to Japan. The cooperation between ASEAN and Japan has been going on for a long time and produced a lot of positive results. The partnerships and cooperation become strategic when it comes to Indo-Pacific. Countries in the region should be able to take advantage of the dynamic situation in this region. In the future, ASEAN-Japan relations related to Indo-Pacific will be more central by the virtue of the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific, or AOIP. Within the AOIP, there are fundamental principles that I believe are really relevant and should be respected by both parties. Academics should be involved strategically in the efforts to see and maximize all the potential in the AOIP scheme. This is the very essence of this meeting, in particular on how we as academics see the potential and the development of the ASEAN-Japan collaboration based on the spirit of AOIP in Indo-Pacific region from various aspects to enhance stability, security, and prosperities of all parties in the future. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, in this case, the Central for Political Studies as a government institution has certain attention to this matter. The situation has a mandate to speak and share its thoughts on these issues of AOIP. So it is our pleasure and honor to hold this seminar together with the mission of Japan to ASEAN. I would like to convey my gratitude to the permanent mission of Japan to ASEAN as our discussion partner that has established this event to be organized. A huge attention from the permanent mission of Japan to ASEAN to this event reflects how strong Japan's commitment is in building a partnership with ASEAN to create a better condition for the future, particularly in Indo-Pacific. On behalf of the Research Center for Politics, I would like to convey a gratitude for the participant and the distinguished speaker, respected invitees, participants, as well as organizing committee that have worked tirelessly for the successful organization of this webinar. Last but not least, ladies and gentlemen, have a productive and fruitful discussion. I thank you.
Thank you. You're welcome, Professor Dr. Firman Nur, Head of Research Center for Politics, Indonesian Institute of Sciences. Before giving the floor to the moderator, allow me to once again remind the general housekeeping rules. The first, if possible, please use the virtual background because we are going to take a picture. Second, make sure you enter the virtual meeting in mute mode or mode silent. And three, please type your question in your chat box. And we also have already remind and write again the general housekeeping rules on the chat box. Don't forget to type your name and your institution. 4, there will be 3 questions on each termine, and there will be 2 termine for the questions after speakers delivered their presentation. Number 5, please fill the absence form. And the last one, e-certificate can only be attained through questionnaire. So after filling the questionnaire, you can get the e-certificate. So for those of you who really want to get the e-certificate, I would like to remind you that you have to fill in the questionnaire regarding this event that can be accessed at the end of the event. So the next session, we are going to have a photo session.
Thank you, Akbar.
Yeah.
Distinguished guests and participants, please activate your camera for a photo session. It will be took in seconds. First scene. 1, 2, 3. Akbar,
yes. Okay, thank you, Pandu. So next session, I will give the floor to Mrs. Fauzan Farhana. She is a researcher from Research Center for Politics, Indonesian Institute of Sciences in the field of ASEAN. So, Mrs. Fauzan Farhana, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much, Akbar. Can you hear me clearly? Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, both from Indonesian that participate in Indonesian, and also good afternoon for those who participate in Japan, because I assume that in the middle of summer, it's still bright and shine there. Okay, and then I hope all of you are safe and also content, because I will need your focus on this webinar for the next 1.5 hours, so that later we will have a lively discussion on our topic today. So our topic today is about Japan-ASEAN cooperation based on the ASEAN Outlook on Indo-Pacific. As Ambassador Akira Chiba has underlined, and also Professor Firman has underlined in their opening remarks, the dynamic in this region has been changing continuously since the first time Japan Prime Minister Shinzo Abe introduced the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy in 2007. This strategy basically underlined that the free and open maritime order based on the rule of law is the foundation of the stability and prosperity of the international community. Then in 2019, ASEAN present their outlook on the Indo-Pacific, which shows the international community that ASEAN intend to play a central role in shaping the economic and security architecture, as well as ensuring that the peace, stability, and prosperity in the region. So all in all, both concepts aims to a very similar goals. But the question now is how Japan and ASEAN can actually realize and work together to reach the goals. Luckily, it's not my job to answer the question. And with us today, we are very fortunate that there are two distinguished speakers that willing to share their expertise and also experience to answer this question on today's topic. So we have here is Professor Dr. Takahara Akio. Hello, Professor. Konnichiwa.
Konnichiwa.
I'm actually practicing this line of sentences. I hope you are allow me to tell you. Honjitsu gotabochu kichou na ojikan o itadakimashita. Makoto ni arigatou gozaimasu. So basically, I'm appreciating that Professor Takahara are willing to share his thought in our forum today. And also, we have my colleagues as a researcher in Indonesian Institute of Sciences, Mr. Nanto Srianto, MSc. Hello, Mas Nanto.
Halo, Uchang.
Terima kasih sudah hadir di acara hari ini. Terima kasih sudah berniat untuk berbagi. And so, yeah, before we move on, it is my job to give you a brief, what do you say? Maybe I can just read the CV from both our speaker. First, from Takahara Sensei. He is a professor of contemporary Chinese politics at the Graduate School of Law and Politics, and also the Graduate School of Public Policy at the University of Tokyo. Professor Takahara has received his diploma in philosophy in 1988 from Sussex University, and later spent several years as visiting scholars at the Consulate General of Japan in Hong Kong, the Japanese Embassy in Beijing, Harvard University, Peking University, and at the MacArthur Institute for China Studies. Before joining the University of Tokyo, he taught at G.F. Oberlin University and Rikyo University. And then he served as the president of the Japan Association for ASEAN Studies and as the Secretary General of the new Japan-China Friendship 21st Century Committee. Takahara Sensei was Dean of the Graduate School of Public Policy from the 2018 to 2020. He currently serves as Senior Adjunct Fellow of the Japan Institute of International Affairs, Distinguished Research Fellow of Japan Forum on International Relations, and Director of JICA Ogata Sadako Research Institute for Peace and Development. His publication include The Politics of Wage Policy in the Post-Revolutionary China, published by Macmillan in 1992, and Japan-China Relation in a Modern Area that was co-authored and published by Routledge in 2017. And then for our next speaker today, Mr. Nanto Srianto, as I was mentioned to you before, he is one of my colleagues in Indonesian Institute of Sciences. He is an associate researcher, and then his research interest covers Indonesian foreign policy, regional dynamics, and middle power approach in international relations. He focused on Indonesian foreign policy that consists of international domestic issues as well as economic security nexus. After Mr. Nanto completed his master from the University of Queensland, he emphasized on developing Indonesia as a middle power country, especially its relation with major power in the region and its network with other middle power in MICTA. And his research team are now working on the research that aims to, that aims to strengthen Indonesian position in the global and international, as well as the Indo-Pacific region. So, as time today is our main constraint, before we move to the discussion, I will encourage all the participants to put their comment, thoughts, or question in the chat box as soon as it appears in your mind. So don't wait until I open the Q&A session for typing the question because it will take time. So I would like to, our team will gather the question, thought, or comment both from the Zoom meeting and from the YouTube comments. And then we will deliver it to the speakers to respond accordingly. Without further ado, I already take your time too much. I will give the first chance to Takahara Sensei to present his presentation for us for maybe 25 to 30 minutes. Professor, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Fauzan Farhana Sensei, for the very kind introduction. I'd also like to extend my sincere thanks to Professor Filman Noor and his Center for Politics at the Indonesian Institute of Sciences, and Ambassador Chiba, my old friend, who is now leading our mission to ASEAN. And thank you very much for everybody who made this wonderful opportunity for me come true. I'm truly honored to be given this opportunity, and I very much look forward to exchanging very frank views with the experts in Indonesia and other Southeast Asian nations. Now, in order to facilitate your understanding of what I'm trying to say, let me share slides with you that I would like to show. Okay. All right, so the title is Japan-ASEAN Cooperation Based on the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific. What a very important topic that we have in front of us today. I think you are all very familiar with the two visions, so I shouldn't go into detail, but it's quite amazing that the two actually share many things and they resonate with each other perfectly, as it were. You know, both identify the Indo-Pacific region as the most dynamic in the world, and they both find opportunities and challenges. Yeah, very pragmatic. We have to acknowledge that there are problems also. So we share this judgment about the current situation in the region. We also share principles, as Ambassador Chiba mentioned, of openness, transparency, inclusiveness, rules-based framework, respect for international law. All these are so important for us both the ASEAN nations and to Japan, aren't they? And we both hold maritime cooperation and connectivity as very key areas in our visions. Yes, so we have so much in common. There's no doubt about that. One word about Japan's interests in the Indo-Pacific. As Farhana Sensei just introduced to us, it originated, as far as Japan is concerned, it originated in former Prime Minister Abe's speech in Delhi in 2007. Now, the basic idea is to empower East Asia, of course, including both Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia, empower East Asia and extend its stability and prosperity to South Asia and Africa, actually. You know, these are the words that Prime Minister Abe said first in Delhi in 2007. The Pacific and the Indian Oceans are now bringing about a dynamic coupling, a seas of freedom and of prosperity. Yes, and in 2016, actually in Nairobi, in Kenya, Africa, when Japan hosted together with Kenya, the TICAD. I think some of you are familiar with TICAD, that is the Tokyo International Conference on African Development. There, he said, Japan bears the responsibility of fostering the confluence of the Pacific and Indian Oceans and of Asia and Africa into a place that values freedom, the rule of law, the market economy that's free from force or coercion, and making it prosperous. So stability, prosperity, very important. And for Japan and Southeast Asia, which is located at the hinge of the two oceans, security of the sea lanes, of course, is another big concern that we have in the Indo-Pacific, right? But there are challenges. In the words of the ASEAN Outlook, it's mentioned like this. There are risks of mistrust, miscalculation, and patterns of behavior based on a zero-sum game. But we all know that these risks do not exist between ASEAN and Japan. And we all know that the elephant in the room is China. So let's face it. You know, Japan has been dubbed as an advanced country in facing new challenges, you know, like environmental pollution, aging society, what have you. Japan has been at the forefront in facing these new challenges, right? And I would say that dealing with a rising China has been a new element, a new topic on this list of newly rising challenges that Japan has had to face a lot earlier than other countries. So perhaps the experience of Japan in dealing with a rising China could be useful as a reference point to you all. That's one point. And secondly, isn't it true that whether Japan and China can establish a stable relationship or not, this constitutes a crucial factor in the future of the Indo-Pacific, and that's going to affect the future of ASEAN also. So I think it is very important to look into Japan-China relations for these reasons, and then on that basis consider what Japan and ASEAN can do together, how we can cooperate to achieve our aims that we have in AOIP and FOIP. Okay, so the analytical framework that I would like to adopt and use in analyzing Japan-China relations is like this. Through a study of the history of Japan-China relations, I have come to the conclusion that all the factors that impact Japan-China relations can be roughly categorized into 4 areas. One is domestic politics of the 2 countries, both in Japan and in China. You know, diplomacy is an extension of domestic politics. We all know that. And certainly the domestic politics in our country, in China, they affect Japan-China relations. I'm sure they affect your relationship with China too. Next, economic interests, no question. Economic interests are so important in our relationship. And usually this works as a positive factor in promoting our bilateral relations with China. But recently, China has been adopting economic statecraft, like they've been doing to the Philippines or to Australia, you know, virtual economic sanctions. So in this area, things are getting a little tricky. But overall, between Japan and China, economics has been a positive factor to promotes Japan-China relations. The third area is the international environment. Yes, international environment, of course, affects Japan-China relations. And we all know that in this part of the world, or perhaps in many parts of the world, the America factor is very important. What kind of policies America is taking towards Asia, is taking towards China, taking towards Japan, that has an impact on Japan-China relations. And since we have an alliance relationship with the United States, and in general in East Asia, American military presence is large. So I have put security, sovereignty issues together with the international environmental factor over here. Is that enough? Actually not in this part of the world. Perceptions of the people, how people perceive the other country, what kind of emotions that the people have about the other side, that actually has an impact on the bilateral relations. Identity, I mean, what kind of country you would like to be, or how you would like to be perceived by other countries. That's the question of identity, and that also affects our relationships. So this is the basic framework. I will look at each area one by one very briefly because of the lack of time and tell you what's going on between Japan and China in recent years. In terms of domestic politics, on the Chinese side, this is what's been the case. The Chinese politicians, the leaders, must avoid the internal critique of being weak-kneed to Japan. You know, people will easily criticize you if you look weak vis-a-vis Japan. So in order to be able to extend a friendly hand towards Japan, that leader must have a very solid power base. Otherwise, it's not easy, since very easily your political rivals will criticize you. And as you know, with President Xi Jinping consolidating his power base very well, that's actually a positive factor in Japan-China relations as far as domestic politics is concerned. What about the Japanese side? The Japanese side, things are a bit complicated because the politicians must attend to 2 things. One is people tend to have negative perceptions of China in recent years, not in the past, not in the 70s, not in the 80s, or even the 90s, but in the past 20 years, let's say, people's image of China has been deteriorating, and now it's very bad, as I will show you in a minute in a graph. So the leader must stand very tough against all these challenges that he is facing. The challenges that come from China, he must face them in a very solid way. But at the same time, people, by reason, we understand the importance of China. We understand the importance of Japan-China relations. So if the political leader does not make an effort to improve and stabilize Japan-China relations, he will be criticized by the people. He will not get votes in elections. So that's the complicated situation. And usually the Japanese leaders will try to stabilize and improve relations while at the same time standing firm against the challengers. All right, that's the situation about domestic politics. International environment. Have you noticed this pattern? China's diplomacy has a certain pattern. That is, when it has a difficult relationship with the United States, China will turn to Japan. And for that matter, China will turn to Europe to balance their international relations. I think they will also turn to ASEAN. For example, now China is having a very tough time with Washington, with the European governments, and with Japan. And China is trying very hard to win the support from the ASEAN countries. Although they have noticed that in the hearts of the ASEAN elite do not really trust China. They have realized that through the public survey conducted by the Yusuf Ishak ICS in Singapore. So they are thinking of ways to overcome this difficulty from their point of view to win the hearts and minds of the ASEAN side now. But anyway, coming back to Japan-China relations, the international environment factor works in such a way that when they have trouble with the US, they will extend a friendly hand towards Japan. And that's what's been happening in the past few years, especially since 2018, when the Trump administration started to take a very tough stance towards China. So if you remember, in October 2018, Prime Minister Abe made a very successful official visit to China. That was the situation. And 2019, things were good too. President Xi Jinping came to Japan. He attended the G20 summit in Osaka, and the relationship was very cordial. But things started to turn for the worse, especially last year. Why is that? I'll come back to that. But before, let me touch on the economics area. Economics area, not much to say because I think you can easily understand the importance of China as an economic partner for Japan. That is shown in this table here. This shows Japan's major trading partners, Japan's trade with them last year. And you can see the outstanding size of our trade with China, the PRC, compared with the other countries. China is #1 trading partner, #2 is US, #3 is the EU taken as a whole. But you can see that EU plus USA is just a little larger than the trade that we have with one country, the PRC. What about the Chinese side? On the Chinese side, of course, Japan's portion in their total trade is not as large as this, but they realized in 2010, when the fishing trawler collision incident happened and things became rather tense between Japan and China, China actually adopted the policy of virtual economic sanctions. But 2 years later, when there was a bigger clash over the Senkaku Islands that happened when the Japanese government purchased the Senkaku Islands from a private landlord, the clash was bigger, but they did not resort to economic sanctions because they learned 2 years before that if they imposed economic sanctions on Japan, they will have a backlash. Since important key components and parts that the Chinese need in manufacturing will stop. They need them. They need to import them from Japan. And Japan's investments in China, especially in those areas which are suffering from the economic downturn, for them, Japan is a very, very important source of investments. So from the Chinese point of view also, Japan's importance in economics is significant, and therefore, generally speaking, economics is a positive factor that promotes the relationship. However, we now have a big problem in people's perceptions. This is the result. This shows the results of the surveys conducted every year by the Japanese NPO called the Genron NPO and their counterpart in China. So the same questions are asked on both sides. And one question asks, what's the impression that you have about the other side? And you can see, let's look at the green line first, because the green line indicates the percentage of the Chinese who have a good image, a favorable image of Japan. And after the Senkaku clash that I mentioned, it hit rock bottom. Only 5% of the Chinese had a favorable view of Japan. But after that, there has been a steady and quick increase in the number of Chinese who have a good image of China. And we think this is related to this, the steady and rapid increase in the number of Chinese visitors to Japan. So once they come to Japan, they realize that Japan is very different. Their real Japan is very different from the Japan that they had been taught back in China, in classrooms or through films, movies, TV dramas. Japan is depicted in a rather negative way, but once they come to Japan, they realize that that's not quite the Japan that is today. And but you can point out, look, in 2020, there was no increase, but it actually corresponds to this. In 2020, because of COVID, hardly anybody came from China. So it explains that there was no increase last year. But the problem is, look at this top red line here. This indicates the percentage of the Japanese who do not have a favorable image of China. And last year, especially because of COVID, this percentage went up even further. And now almost 90% of the Japanese don't have a good image of China. And this questionnaire asks, why is that the case? And the biggest answer relates to this. Because the Chinese send their government vessels, the Coast Guard vessels, into the Japanese territorial waters around the Senkaku Islands, where China claims, or has been claiming since 1971. Before that, they didn't claim sovereignty, but in 1971, December, suddenly they started claiming. And you can see that after the clash in 2012, they have increased the number of vessels they send in such a way. And in recent years, look at how many vessels, the blue line indicates the number of vessels that come into the contiguous zone just outside the territorial waters. It's a record-breaking number. So the Chinese have started to move, have started to act and exert physical force on Japan. And the Japanese, of course, don't like this at all. And adding to this, there's been the human rights questions in Xinjiang and Hong Kong, and then came COVID. So you understand how high the negative sentiment has gone up in Japan. And this is beginning to affect the attitudes of the politicians in some ways. So now it is very difficult for Japan to extend a friendly hand towards China. The atmosphere is rather bad. That's reality. And this is, I think some of you are familiar. This indicates a very rapid rise in China's defense budget. And now you can see the yellow line indicates the amount of the defense budget in Japan. Now it is only 1/4 of the money in that the Chinese use for their defense. So you understand this sense of urgency and the pressure that the Japanese side feels. So we are making these judgments. So we perceive China by deeds rather than words, right? And as far as their actions are concerned, we the neighboring nations, including you in Southeast Asia, we share concerns, a lot of concerns about China's actions, right? Especially their maritime advancement, or as far as the Mekong River area countries are concerned, the flow of water along the Mekong River. But anyhow, as far as Japan's concerned, It's the maritime advancement that's our largest concern. And the way the Chinese have been handling this is what I call action is based on action first-ism, meaning they will first act and establish fait accompli, and then let diplomacy take care of the rest. When they have the chance, when they have the ability, when they see the opportunity to move, they will move. That's what they've been doing in the past few years. And you know what have they been doing? They've been doing all sorts of things, as I have listed here. We are all very familiar with their oil and gas exploration, construction of artificial islands, harassing of the fishing boats and reconnaissance vessels, etc., etc., etc. But their words are very soft, right? But their deeds, their actions are very tough. Why is this gap? Well, there are many ways to explain this, because it has now the capabilities. They don't respect the rules. To think of it, inside their own country, they don't respect rules very much. They talk about rule of law, but in fact, there is no rule of law. So I very much sympathize with the Chinese people. They live in a system in which order is supported by the outstanding power of the Chinese Communist Party. Order is not supported by law, but it's by the outstanding power of the Chinese Communist Party. So I call it Pax Comunista. That's the order inside China. And for some people who envisage a Pax Sinica in the region, it seems to be just an extension of Pax Comunista to outside their borders. And that's, of course, not acceptable to us. But, you know, the leaders perhaps don't care if there were frictions here and there, because what they fear most is critique from inside, from the people. You are weak-kneed. You know, you are not doing enough to defend our interests, to realize our interests overseas. That's what they fear. So in fact, to have some friction with other countries could be actually better, you know, in order to unite the nation, in order to unite the party. And of course, at the basis of this is the high heat of nationalism in the Chinese society, as we saw on the 1st of July, when Xi Jinping was giving the speech, a very long one, almost one hour. People were getting very tired of listening to it, but there were moments when they woke up and applauded very enthusiastically. Those were the places where Xi Jinping mentioned very harsh nationalistic words, and people liked that. That's the situation in China today. And also, personally, on a personal basis, Xi Jinping is a leader who has the propensity to act. You know, who said this? Chinese nation's energy has been suppressed for too long. Let it explode and realize the Chinese dream. 1 week after the Hague International Arbitral Tribunal's ruling that China's argument about the South China Sea had no basis, 1 week after that, of course, it's Xi Jinping who said that. And there's also some problem in self-perception, I would say. What do I mean by that? You know, it's a big power syndrome, as it were. Maybe it's not only China, but big countries all have this syndrome. I'll cite some examples. China calls its neighborhood diplomacy peripheral diplomacy now. And I tell my Chinese friends, you should change this way of putting it. Because if you say peripheral diplomacy, it means, it implies that you are the center and the neighbors are the periphery. And all my Chinese friends say, you're right, we should change this name. But they don't realize it themselves. And up to this day, they haven't changed how they call this. And Xi Jinping likes to talk about the DNA. You know, the blood of the Chinese nation does not contain the DNA to invade others and become a hegemon. He also said that on July 1st. But we all know that this is not true. Don't say this in front of our Vietnamese friend here. He or she will get very angry. Another example is Zheng He, or Chong Ho, the great admiral in the early 15th century in the Ming Dynasty, who led this huge fleet of armada to Southeast Asia, South Asia, even to Africa. And now the Chinese Communist Party has made him the symbol of China's peaceful maritime advancement. But I found out in Sri Lanka that at the National Museum, saying that Chong Ho was actually an invader. Chong Ho invaded our country, that's what it said. And then I later found out that such sayings exist in Java too, for example, because one mission of Chong Ho was to include those kingdoms into the tributary system. And one king in Ceylon refused, and he was attacked, he was caught, and all his family was sent to China. That's why the Sri Lankan National Museum today even say that, sorry, the National History Museum tells us that they were invaded. But, you know, the Chinese say Chong Ho did not make anybody a slave, did not colonize any piece of land, very different from the European imperialists, etc. But they have to understand how things are viewed from the outside, and there could be a huge gap in the perceptions from theirs. All right. So Japan has had to adopt a two-pronged approach for some time. Two-pronged approach, of course, one prong is competition and the other prong is cooperation. There's no choice but to respond to China's maritime advancement and its attempts to change the status quo by physical force. We cannot concede on this point. So, you know, from a realistic point of view, there's no way but other than increasing the budget for the self-defense forces and the Coast Guards. And we have had to reinforce our alliance with the United States and other allies. And we have to assist, we think we need to assist the capacity building of friends in a way that our constitution allows, right? But at the same time, we know we have to cooperate, continue cooperating with China. We were very happy to sign RCEP, and we are cooperating on a daily basis on anti-piracy, environmental protection, anti-drug trafficking, health and sanitation, including COVID, and we want to promote cultural exchange with the Chinese, no doubt. I think it's the same with you, with the ASEAN nations. All have this wish to establish a stable, developing relations with a friendly China, right? And to think of it, for a long time, Japan-China relations have had two aspects in it. One is the fragile aspect, and the other is the resilient aspect. So the ideal situation is we should both, Japan and China, should both cooperate and control the fragile aspect of the relationship, such as security, islands, history, and so on, and promote the resilient side, economic cooperation, cooperation in non-traditional security issues, and so on and so forth. So we have had to do competition and cooperation at the same time. Where can we cooperate? In the Indo-Pacific. You know, the free and open Indo-Pacific is Japan's vision, but the Chinese side have their Belt and Road Initiative, right? So I've been arguing that FOIP and the BRI, they are compatible. We can cooperate. And my understanding of the BRI is, first, it's a diplomatic and political genius of the Chinese. It's a concept. It's not something that is real and tangible. You know, I liken it to a constellation in the sky. Have you ever seen a constellation? I don't think so, because constellations don't exist, right? They're only concepts that exist in our brains. The Belt and Road Initiative is just like that. No one can define it very clearly. The contour is very blurred, right? But the stars, I mean, the projects are real, yeah, and tangible. So what we should be doing is to look at the stars, and we should not be dazzled by the constellation, by the stars. Because Xi Jinping is pointing to the sky saying, look at all the stars. You see a dragon there. That's the Belt and Road. And we go, wow, yeah? And our eyes are glittering with Chinese renminbi. Very, very clever, very, it's a genius concept, I would say. Chinese are very good at this. For example, reform and open. Sorry, I'm speaking for too long. I'll try to wrap up in a minute. And if I was pushed to define the BRI, I would define it as a symbol of Xi Jinping's power and authority in the world. Actually, FOIP is also a constellation. So two constellations can share stars, no problem. Yeah, we do a project together. We do a project with ASEAN, AOIP, FOIP. We can make stars together and say it's part of FOIP, it's part of AOIP, no problem whatsoever. Yes, so that's what we should be doing. You know, let's understand that FOIP and BRI both have two aspects. One is the economic aspect, the other is the security aspect. Both are important. Yeah. But if we focused on the economic aspect, we can cooperate, we can share stars. That's what I want to say. But there are challenges. You know, I think you're familiar with the challenges, but as I mentioned, you know, now the atmosphere in Japan is so bad that it may be wise not to move at this moment. So we should wait till this atmosphere settles down and changes. And also another difficulty is it's difficult in finding a suitable project. We've been looking for a good one, but we haven't been able to find one, partly because infrastructure projects are not profitable. But anyhow, we would like our ASEAN friends to help here. There's large space for ASEAN-Japan cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. We should set an example of cooperation and lure the Chinese to join us. That's what I would like to, one of the important points that I would like to mention today. But there are basic challenges because the two-pronged approach is basically inherently contradictory. Yeah. So psychologically, it's not easy for many people to take it, you know, and therefore we must have the resilience and the wisdom to live with this contradiction, to live through this contradiction. However, to strike a balance is going to be increasingly difficult because on the one hand, competition is going to intensify. We can't avoid it if Xi Jinping doesn't change his way. On the other hand, cooperation is going to deepen. So increasingly, it's difficult to maintain the middle way and our nations will be divided. Yeah. So we shall need to use a lot of time and energy on internal coordination and persuasion. But we have to be ready for that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Nakahara, for that was some interesting and intriguing as well, because to highlight that the future of Indo-Pacific relies on the relation between Japan and China. At some point, this might be true, and thanks God this is academic forum, so everyone can give comments and thought about this. And because of that, I noticed in the chat box there are already 4 questions and 3 specifically put for Takahara Sensei. But I have to say, please be patient for the people who already put their question, because I'd like to give the floor to our next speaker, Mr. Nanto Srianto first, before we open the Q&A question. So without further ado, the floor is yours, Mr. Nanto.
Thank you, Fauzan. Distinguished guests, Takahara Sensei, Excellencies, and my senior, Pak Luhu, Ibu Deputy, Prof. Irman as head of Center for Political Studies. Thank you for the organizing committee for this great opportunity. I currently stay in a hotel in Samarinda, actually, and it's a great opportunity for me to speak from the province that I don't know. Maybe it was part of the Indonesian project. Maybe soon's going to be our new capital here in eastern province of Kalimantan. So dear distinguished guests, I want to, my presentation is about sharing with you some of insight that I get from my informants here, and I also inspired by my colleagues from border studies, Sandi. Let's say that in speaking as a student of international relations, this is not only to speak from the Jakarta or capital centers, but also from the local areas where when discussing IR and Indo-Pacific is something that maybe not directly related to their life, but soon will affect their daily life. Okay, my presentation is mostly about that. So I have a similar opinion share with Takahara Sensei also, but I want to share with you another important insight that I think when ASEAN and Japan will have a great cooperation in this issue. Can you see my slide, Ochang? Okay. Distinguished guests, colleagues, and friends, I want to share with you my presentation. Basically, there are 4 parts in this. I will elaborate the current situation, and then I will move to the ASEAN Outlook as a local narratives, and then I briefly elaborate Japan and its FOIP because mostly have been elaborated by Takahasa Sensei, and then I will come to several issues that I think could be a great opportunity for both sides to have cooperation. Okay, at first, Takahara Sensei that China is an elephant in the room. But I think also we know that this is the competition between 2 giants in the region, and I think this is one of the big issues for Indonesia and other members country of ASEAN, that in China and the US, I think there are certain development that affect their international posture, especially in China, since the rise and then the new normal after Xi Jinping took presidencies, I think almost 10 years ago. So the rise of China brings to the fore the issue of state and market relation, and also economic security nexus. It was the situation of China's rise also bring the choice of the regional countries to see that there is a different kind of development. It is not a matter of whether it will suit their interest, but I think it is kind of a different alternative. I would stop at that point. And then also the practice of international development assistance. We quite familiar with the term of debt trap and so on, but I think it is part of also the practice that China bring with its economic growth. We know also familiar with the Angola model in African countries when China suddenly become close relation with the government of Angola, despite that in the previous era, China supporting the rebels instead of the government. And so I also share the belief that the presidency of Xi Jinping brings something new in China's international diplomacy. And then I want to highlight also about the US from about like almost a decade or more since Obama. I think the ideas of the US in the region, the term has been from rebalancing, pivoting, and then the Indo-Pacific come to the fore when President Trump mentioned it in his speech. So basically, I would say that the US share the different kind of practice in this region. Mostly the US emphasizing on hub and spoke with its strategic partners in the region. While during President Obama, it started to admit that multilateralism in the region also a vital tools in the region. And so I think this is a matter of reassurance and a shifting of strategic culture, whether in large extent or small extent. I think we can discuss it later. And I would say in this case, Japan also important aspect in the region since since 90s, Japan has been calibrated its diplomacy, like want to be more active from since the what do you call it as a checkbook diplomacy up to now, since Prime Minister Abe a speech about Indo-Pacific, and also Japan's have to manage its economic challenge. I think since Plaza Accord, we know that Japan have been suffered from the bubble economy, and finding a new role balance between economic and security is the latest development in Japan, and it is a very important part that will affect the development in the region. And then I will say that ASEAN, in responding to this development, have I think want to respond. Its vision about how does to cope the competition between two giants and also emerging active player like Japan, India, etc. And then also ASEAN wants to manage how does domestic democratic stagnation and rising of developmentalism in the several countries of ASEAN. And then I think ASEAN Outlook on Indo-Pacific is actually more about how the local narratives can be part of the contentious or debate between the two giants. So yeah, since the this is also part of our research. So this is a discussion between me and my colleagues in foreign policy research group, and about the discourse itself. I think there's two nexus that important to strengthen in here. That it is about geopolitics and geoeconomics. The both sides, it's like two sides of a coin. So it is cannot be separated between one thing and the other. So the needs to ensure open economics and right to choose development path, also important ingredients in this discourse of building a new regional like Indo-Pacific. While at the same time, I think the local countries also admit that the needs to have regional stability and national sovereignty is important. So these two main issues will affect the decision of each country in the region to voicing their voicing their target and objectives. And then the other aspect that important, and I think it is shared with Takara Sensei, that it is also part of international and domestic politics. So the interdomestic aspect of the Indo-Pacific, most of us will think that Indo-Pacific is a great power competition and so on. But I think Indo-Pacific itself is a matter of the need to respond international dynamics, but also to maintain the national interest. In this case, in this case, like several countries in Indonesia, especially, in terms of Indo-Pacific moment, Indonesia have to balance the needs of maintaining economic development. While it is not easy, to have economic growth in post resource boom. So how to balance the domestic infrastructure needs with the international dynamics is a issue for several countries, especially in ASEAN, that become the center of the tension. So how does the countries in the region sees the two giants? I think it is quite interesting to cite the survey from Pew Research. From it is not ASEAN to ASEAN as a collective country, but it is Indonesia, Japan, Philippines, South Korea, India, and Australia. So from members of ASEAN, Indonesia and Philippines represented in this survey. But I want to note here is that in Indonesian case, the perspective about the US and China is quite dropping here. And it is also happening in Philippines. While in Australia, which seems as a close ally of the US, its population, the respondent shows that it is China that become more positively perceived by the locals. While in case of India and Japan, and especially South Korea, the discrepancy is quite great. So what happened in Indonesia and the Philippines, I think it also become the depiction of what might be the rest of members of ASEAN say about the competition between the giants. They feel that uncertain, or it is better to look for themselves. It is some kind of like inward looking in my perspective. And also it has been supported by how does my informants here share that Indo-Pacific is Jakarta's concept. Why they don't see it as something. Even this is IR scholars. They see the locals would have directly involved in this kind of high politics. So this is a matter of how to make Indo-Pacific as a down-earth issues is another challenge for policymakers to consider how does what we perceive as a threat or an opportunity also shared by the local government or people in the regional province. And then, yeah, I would not go too long for the ASEAN Outlook on Indo-Pacific. Several articles commenting on ASEAN Outlook. Some would consider that it is Vulcan language, rather don't want to touch several important issues, even doesn't mention directly China or the US, but more focus on several research cooperation that ASEAN want to have, rather than directly criticizing the challenge, like even is only limited in wording about South China Sea and so on. So yeah, basically, I interpret that the ASEAN Outlook on Indo-Pacific is a matter of how to maintain the local narratives under such a great contention between BRI or Indo-Pacific, rather Indo-Pacific from Japan, the US, India, or Australia. So it's quite interesting that ASEAN knows that by strengthening or by being inward looking, it will become more strategic to respond the great debate among the great power. So that's my point in this case. So I'm not an economist, so, but I think several important statistics from ASEAN statistic worth to mention here. Like I want to share that it is a great indication for ASEAN that import of goods coming from internal ASEAN market. It is a quarter of most ASEAN market come from ASEAN. So it is a good development, I think, since the development of ASEAN, mostly internal market of ASEAN is quite limited, but I'm not sure what the factors behind it, but I think it is a great indication, and the sharing of ASEAN partners is quite various. In this case, we can see that even EU, China, the US, and Japan have a quite amount of export of goods, import of goods in ASEAN. The rest will be shared by Australia. This is even, we can see United Arab Emirates, even Taiwan and Hong Kong. And also in this case, we can see that the import of goods. So it is quite, I'm quite optimistic when people would dare to challenge whether ASEAN will be an orbit of China or not. I think in this case, China could still maintain its unity and also maintaining its chance to recalibrate its position against another its strategic partners. But somehow another case is in this international air passenger traffic. From the data, I can see from my perspective that it is Thailand and Singapore, the two ASEAN countries that enjoy playing as a hub for the countries in the region with the outside. And while the Malaysia come as a third, Indonesia as the fourth, I think the two countries, ASEAN, Thailand and Singapore, have a more directly flight to the outside of the region. And in this case, I think that the ASEAN itself is actually position itself as a quite nexus between the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. And in this case, I want to see whether the ASEAN community, which one of it is people-centeredness, is how does the people-centeredness of ASEAN is developed. In this case, Malaysia has become more central in Asian tourism because it shares almost more than a half in 2010, and it shares in almost 1 decade in 2020. It shares, it decreased, but it will followed by Thailand. It will followed by, and Indonesia also have more than almost double of its share of visitors. So this kind of simple indicators that I would say a good indicators of ASEAN unity, of ASEAN centeredness. When you talk to people in layman people, how does they spend their vacation? How does they see which country they want to go? I think each member of ASEAN will consider another countries in ASEAN. So it is quite good development that challenge the state-centricness of ASEAN. And also compared to the visitor of arrivals in ASEAN, the ASEAN among ASEAN members shared previously in 2010 shared almost half, but it decreased, while the significant numbers that increase is unfortunately, or not unfortunately, it is actually an ASEAN. I think based on this data, it can say that ASEAN is Asian and East ASEAN, which is other ASEAN. ASEAN and other ASEAN countries have a more direct visit with each other. So this is a position which considered ASEAN become more central in between and in the development of the idea of Indo-Pacific. And the last indicator that I consider as important is trend in cellular or mobile phone. This is related to what they call it as a new popularism, related also to how the voice of individuality had been raised. So in terms of this, Indonesia and Thailand shared a significant increase in their cellular and mobile phone density since 2010 and up to 2019, while Singapore quite stable. Malaysia have been fluctuated but can be considered stable. And what happened in Myanmar also important. The increasing has been uh, outnumbered the Laos, and also I think Vietnam have been one of the busiest mobile phone user in ASEAN. So in terms of participant in online discussion, maybe it can be considered that each country have been transformed into something new. So it is quite important, even though I know that a further research is needed. I think uh, it is quite indication that ASEAN is changing and the unity is growing in positive side. So I been moved to Japan FOIP. Uh, we have been deeply discussed by Takahara Sensei that, but I want to stress a brief several factors that I do admit that is important for ASEAN. Since the first idea of Indo-Pacific delivered by the Prime Minister Abe in New Delhi, I think it is also indicate a new posture of Japan foreign policy. I think the Pacific and Indian Oceans, by stating that in India, Japan want to mention that it is important to see Indian Ocean as part of its foreign policy. And then another the speech from Prime Minister Abe and uh, statement from Minister of Foreign Affairs of Japan, I think there are spirits of ASEAN and Africa spirit, as well as the new thing is democratic issues in Japan foreign policy. I can remember that when Indonesia undergoing transition to democracy in early 2000, Japan for ODA have only small number on democratic issues, while mostly on technical issues. And by stating that democratic is one of the emphasized issue of Japan, I think this is a new move, while also I think we want to share that Indonesia have a similar sense of democracy, but through the Bali Democratic Forum, Indonesia would rather to have sharing lesson learned rather than becoming a promoter of democracy that intervening other domestic politics of other nation. So it is a good indication, but also needs to reassure what the aspect of democratic dimension that Japan want to share with ASEAN members. And before too long, I just want to jump into what possibly be strategic cooperative between Japan and ASEAN. There are four issues that I think after discussing with local informants in here in East Kalimantan, also previously in Jakarta and South Sulawesi, it is the development issues is the one of the strategic issues between Indonesia and Japan. South cooperations and also path dependence in development. What I mean by path of dependent in development is that the participation of the local will increase when the world of Indo-Pacific also include the terms of economic participation of the locals. So whether the geoeconomics already there, but I think it is need to be elaborated into something more practical. So it is not a matter of contending strategic vision, but it is more about more practicality by the local actors in the by the local actors for the local actors. I mean, and the second one about the infrastructure. It has been mentioned by Takahara Sensei that infrastructure is also important, and both Japan and China share the infrastructure issues. But I want to emphasize in here is that building local economics that speak for themselves. Somehow we don't know when there is a road buildings will benefit the locals or just a matter for the exporting the local resources to other countries. So this kind of empowering the locals or development development for the locals is another terms that to be inserted in infrastructure development. And I also want to raise in this case that competition on development on infrastructure without empowering the locals will also create more problem for the host countries rather than helping them. And the third one that important for me is that maritime economy. Indonesia has been have a lot more jargon about maritime economy, but I think claiming territory through economic cooperation in this aspect will be important. We don't know how, we know that the South China Sea is not only about military vis-a-vis military, but it is more about how the civil actors become quote unquote militarized. But I think by building local powers on this issue, it is more lessening or civilizing the conflict into more than threatening compared to, we know that in South China Sea, there is a issue of non-traditional security cooperation, but somehow because of militarizing the civilian, it has become more hard to achieve cooperation among the conflicting parties. But I think by building other side, especially the ASEAN members or Indonesia in this case, it is a good starting point for Indonesia to reclaiming the territory rather than just sending a marine on the remote island. And the last one is ASEAN capacity. What I mean by ASEAN capacity is how does ASEAN brought the ideas in localizing the ideas. It is very important since like in this case, in this time of pandemic, it is important to have why does vaccine diplomacy is important, but I think how does the ASEAN itself in dividing its vaccine diplomacy is become so scattered. So in terms of pandemic diplomacy or vaccine diplomacy, it is a good chance for solidifying the ideas and how does the local participate in common problems rather than dividing. So, and it is good to have Japan as our partner in this case. And I think Indonesia and Japan have deal on several cooperation lately, and it is good to have it on ASEAN level. Thank you, dear participant. That's my presentation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nanto Srianto, for the excellent presentation on how actually derivating a foreign policy to the local people will become one of a potential to implement or reach the goals that has been set by these foreign concepts. But of course, with this limited time, there is too much to ask. So I try to go through all the questions that has been posed in the chat room, and I realized that there are some questions that are quite similar, and there is of course each has their own things to point out. And that's with that, I will try to conclude one question from like four people for that we specified to Takahara Sensei. And this question mostly asks about how like they want further elaboration on how Japan's strategy in implementing the free and open Indo-Pacific, and whether the changes in domestic politics will affect this implementation. And then also, where is ASEAN in that process? And other than that, there are like 4 people who specifically asked specific question, and I hope Takahara Sensei already see them as well. So maybe to open the Q and ask question, I will give the floor to Takahara Sensei to respond to this question. Please, Takahara Sensei.
Yes, terima kasih. Thank you for all the questions. But let me address the one that was just mentioned by Fauzan Farhana Sensei. That is the relationship between domestic politics. I understand that to be domestic politics in Japan, and the relationship between that and FOIP, and what's the role of ASEAN here. I think the Japanese economy now has been hit by COVID, but we find external markets very important, including China's, but in the Indo-Pacific region at large, infrastructure export is something, of course, that the Japanese business circles are aiming for. And the role of Southeast Asia is crucial because the Japanese firms are more familiar with the situation in Southeast Asia. And we understand that it is a lot easier to do business in Southeast Asia than the regions towards the West, where the Japanese have less experience, less knowledge, and therefore, our prime target, as far as I understand it, I'm not a business person, but I can understand that the prime target is still in Southeast Asia. The domestic political situation, of course, should support that. And perhaps not immediately we can include China. When Mr. Abe visited China, made an official visit in October 2018, 52 MOUs were signed for cooperation between Japan and China in a third country. And quite a few of those projects were targeted to the Southeast Asian nations. But it may take some time because there are so many difficulties, not only political, but technical. And we have to be very pragmatic and realistic when it comes to bankability of those projects. But with great help from our Southeast Asian friends, let us explore the possibilities and find good ones that perhaps we can involve other countries too. I mentioned only China, but the United States, they have their plan to increase their investments in the Indo-Pacific region. We are all interested in the Mekong project. So there's a lot of area that we can search and find good projects. There were many other questions, but let me begin from here. That's my answer to your question.
Thank you, Professor. And to Mr. Nanto Srianto, there is also a question here regarding the Thucydides trap. And from Ahmad Sukri, that he is very interested to see your thought about how the potential of the Thucydides trap will lead to an open war, affects Japan's position in the Pacific and ASEAN in the South China Sea for the future. Yeah, please, Mr. Nanto.
Yeah. Sorry. Thank you for the question, Mr. Ahmad Sukri. Regarding the Thucydides trap, I think the sorry, yeah. I have a comment on this issue Thucydides trap about based on my perspective, which actually empowering the local agency. The Thucydides trap will not be occurred if there is a strong middle powermanship in the region, and in this case, Thucydides trap had occurred in the past because of we let the regional dynamics loosely on the decision of the great powers. I think the participation of the locals will diminish the chance of recurring of similar to Thucydides trap. That's my point. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And we noticed that from in the beginning, Pak Rene Patria Jawane has raised his hand for Takahara Sensei and other people. He is a renowned specialist on Chinese studies in Indonesia. So I would like to give him opportunity to ask the question. Please, Pak Rene. You're still muted.
Yeah, I'm on me. Thank you for the time and having me in this interesting discussions. I'd like to ask to Professor Takahara and Nanto actually, how do you try to confluence? Yeah, I haven't heard anything that you Professor Takahara is talking about how FOIP is being established as a confluence of the two oceans, go back to Prime Minister Abe's speech, and Nanto is also trying to expose more on the ASEAN initiative, the AOIP, the AOIP, I mean, but how do you confluence the relations between this FOIP and this AOIP? Because it seems to me that the driven of a new era of an Indo-Pacific shape is being only driven by the US through the Quad initiative. So whatever initiative, security initiative, economic initiative that has been proposed in Southeast Asia regions, as long as it uses the terms of Indo-Pacific, China will always say it is being an expanding hands of the Americans. Okay. So my question is, how do you confluence that? Trying to have and expand the issues as a more regional born of initiative, since now I think ASEAN Centrality is already in a limbo. ASEAN is already being divided regarding to the Myanmar issues, for example. But we cannot try to project whether the FOIPs or the AOIP implementing to solve the issues in Myanmar, for example. Economic side, I think, on a pandemic situation like this, it will be very difficult to expand. Japan is already being hampered by lack of chipsets for cars, for electronics, for televisions, for handphones, for a lot of things. Thank you.
Shall I answer?
Perhaps, yeah, please, Professor.
I think Professor said many things, and for example, the question of ASEAN unity is something that I cannot discuss in detail. I should ask you about what's going on in ASEAN. But what I would like to say is, I think ASEAN unity, integration is the integrity of ASEAN is going to be very important. For outside countries like Japan too. So we have been supporting ASEAN in promoting its unity, and I think we shall continue to do that. So we have high hopes in Indonesia, for example, to take a leading role in getting people together, getting nations together, and beef up the ASEAN centrality in conducting international affairs. That's our hope. And if there's anything that we can be of help, we will not hesitate to provide that. Another question is how China has been treating FOIP. And I think it's very interesting that if you carefully observe and look into what they've been saying about FOIP, they have actually understood the difference in the weight that the US puts on the FOIP and the area in which Japan puts its weight. You know, I told you that FOIP together with BRI have two aspects. One is that of security, the strategic aspect of FOIP. That's where the US puts its emphasis, places its emphasis. They place the emphasis on security issues. Well, of course, not only that. You may have noticed that in the Quad meeting, first summit that was held in April, you noticed that we talked about a lot of civilian, economic, and social cooperation issues, right? But the Japanese, very specifically, we have been emphasizing the economic cooperation aspect of FOIP, and the Chinese have realized it. You know, we first called it the Free and Open Indo-Pacific Strategy, but then we changed the name to Free and Open Indo-Pacific Vision. And nowadays, we don't even say what it is. We just say the Free and Open Indo-Pacific. And the Chinese have realized this difference. So if you observe very carefully, you'll find that the Chinese have never criticized Japan for its free and open Indo-Pacific vision. So, you know, had Xi Jinping been able to visit Japan in April 2020 as planned, of course, that had to be postponed. It hasn't been realized yet. But had that visit taken place, you know, our thinking was that we wanted him to say that on certain conditions, you know, he's free to put conditions like Mr. Abe did about BRI, but on certain conditions, China can cooperate with the Japanese vision of FOIP. So let us not misunderstand that FOIP is only about security. It's only about competition, but it has an aspect of economic cooperation, and there we can do real business with the Chinese.
Yes, Mr. Nanto, please,
Yeah.
your
Thank you, Bang Rani, for raising this question, and I think it's important to share with Takara Sensei about Quad itself. Indo-Pacific become the uh, 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 word of exchange or buzzword among the Quad, but I think it's also important to underline that each country in the Quad have a different geographical imagination, different emphasize and focus on their development. Like even the last thing that I remember is when the US and India have a 2+2 meeting in New Delhi. The speech gave by its representative emphasized different things. Even India, mentioned the local powers. I think so. The narrative of the local here also emphasized by several quotes, and we know that India in his Indo-Pacific basically focus on securing its dominant position in Indian Ocean, despite the fact that it's already relatively success in Act East policy. And even in Australia, the emphasizing of Pacific itself rather than while also maintaining the rising of Indian Ocean is important. But I think Australia doesn't want to lose its traditional sphere of influence in Pacific. So this different kind of emphasizing between security and economic have become the important issues for us to discuss and observe. And while what I want to share with you about what the FOIP and ASEAN in one of critical juncture is emphasizing on infrastructure. What I want to discuss on this issue is that while all countries have joined in supporting infrastructure development, I just don't want to lose the local narrative or local interest in this case. Even I admitted that I forget to mention that the US, especially Biden administration, have provided amount of money in infrastructure development. But I don't know. I want to share this belief from Jurgen Ruland about competition in infrastructure without paying attention to the locals. Will only jeopardize the growing the democratic aspect of each ASEAN members, especially the fragile one. So infrastructure development in several countries have already affected human rights, right? This development and human rights issue have been juggled. So in this case, why do I mention multiplex? Because there is no longer one strict issues between the one line human rights and infrastructure. And in case of Myanmar, I'm not expert on Myanmar. There is already Lydia who have more information and knowledge about this issue. But I think in case of Myanmar, I can share with you some regional countries like India. Isolating Myanmar is not only one solution because it only push Myanmar to another orbit. So this kind of in-betweenness, maybe we have to admit there is a atrocity in Myanmar. But in diplomacy, I think in ASEAN, which actually quite state-centric, it is now under challenge. But I do remember and I do share belief that I hope ASEAN will stand on the right side of history. That's my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Chang, maybe, yeah. I just want to share that this is important, but I shared this several times with you. Maybe you have heard about my joke when I was asked by foreign journalists whether Indonesia gonna choose China or US. I usually reply this that we are Indonesian. We don't take multiple choice. We do essay. We write our own answer. So that's my position. Thank you.
Yeah, I heard these jokes very often. It sometimes stick in my mind. So, okay. Thank you very much, Takara Sensei and Mr. Nanto Srianto for this for sharing your thought and also expertise on the answering our today's topics. And I'm really apologize for the participant that has been very lively and in asking questions, but unfortunately, because of the time constraint, we can cover all the questions. But all of your enthusiasms is recorded, and I hope personally, of course, in our institute, we can make another discussion like this in the future. So then probably then in the next opportunity, we can cover that question together.
Chiba pointed out the rapid changes and dynamics in the Indo-Pacific region. In response to the dynamics, cooperation between countries in the region, including Japan and ASEAN member states, becomes relevant and important. Therefore, both Japan and ASEAN have shared common interests to advance cooperation under the Free and Open Indo-Pacific and ASEAN Outlook on Indo-Pacific. Speakers also discussed both FOIP and AOIP visions and highlighted the possible cooperations between Japan and ASEAN in enhancing the rule-based international order in the Indo-Pacific. Professor Takahara from the University of Tokyo pointed out the shared interests and principle between the FOIP and AOIP, and even with BRI, that put maritime cooperations and connectivity as key areas of cooperation. He emphasized stability and prosperity that should be the underlying principles of such cooperation in the region. He recognized also that the FOIP concept contains both competitive and cooperative strategies towards China, aiming to enhance the existing international order. Professor Takahara also identified some possible challenges in this two-pronged approach, including to balance between the two approaches, issues of coordination and problems of trust and China's self-perception. Interestingly, I think Professor Takahara discussed how people's perceptions, economic interests, domestic politics, and international environment have shaped Japan's relations with China. He then suggested that the experiences on how Japan dealing with China can be shared with other states in the Indo-Pacific region. The second speaker, Mr. Nanto Srianto from the Center for Politics, also highlighted how the rise of China and the changing role of US in the region have shaped the relations between Japan and ASEAN. He argued to the importance of local narratives or interests to substance the Indo-Pacific vision amid different emerging concepts on Indo-Pacific, including FOIP and AOIP. Finally, Mr. Nantos suggested 4 possible cooperations between Japan and ASEAN as a way to localize Indo-Pacific. They include development, infrastructure, maritime economy, and enhancing ASEAN capacities. Despite the important points highlighted by both speakers, to me personally, the fact that the FOIP strategy or vision is not a one-time concept was not sufficiently discussed. What is interesting is how Japan's FOIP concept has evolved over time from strategy to vision, for example, as a way to accommodate responses and requests from regional states, including from ASEAN member states. What I want to highlight is Japan's objective in relation to the FOIP, such as maintaining and enhancing the existing international order in the Indo-Pacific region, can be realized only when regional states and actors, including ASEAN member states, share their vision, pursue complementary policies, and coordinate those policies effectively. Since ASEAN has been the center of regional multilateralism and Southeast Asia is at the center of Indo-Pacific, I think the role of ASEAN in the Japanese FOIP concept should be clearly defined. Crucially, the FOIP should pay attention on the importance of ASEAN centrality in the Indo-Pacific region and reaffirm the importance of the East ASEAN Summit and other ASEAN-led institutions in the region. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Research Center for Politics, we would like to send our appreciation to Mission of Japan to ASEAN for initiating this important academic forum. Thank you also for all the speakers for delivering such important materials that can deepen our knowledge about the potential cooperation between Japan and ASEAN countries under the Indo-Pacific. Also, we would like to thank all participants who joined this webinar, particularly from Indonesia and Japan. Finally, we'd like to thank the organizer for preparing this webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, on behalf of every committee, I would like to say thank you
Panjang
for
amat,
joining
Atika.
this event. And yeah, and I was ordered to conclude the event with a positive note. So allow me to read. Indonesia is expected to play an important role in promoting the values of unity, openness, and bringing ASEAN and Indo-Pacific towards more prosperous and peaceful area. Therefore, cooperation is the key to unlock the possible opportunities. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. So,
Okay.
Unlock. Mesti beli gembok di ACE.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you very much for everyone.
Terima kasih. Bye-bye.
Terima kasih. Arigatou gozaimasu.
Thank you, Takara Sensei.
Thank you very much.
Nice to meet you.
Thank you. Nice seeing
Maybe
you.
I will
Thank
meet you in Tokyo
Yes,
to interview you.
Look forward to that. Bye.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Rak.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Yeah.
Bang Rafendi, makasih.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Mohon maaf Pak Rafendi, tadi nggak kelihatan.
Nggak apa-apa.
Stay safe,
Nggak
everyone.
berani ngomong banyak-banyak soal Myanmar, ada abang. Takut saya.
Rada slow.
Terima kasih semua peserta yang sudah hadir dari awal.
Terima kasih semua. Sehat selalu.
Ya,
Amin.
terima kasih. Sehat selalu.
Izin live ya, Ucang.
Siap.
Sini sudah
Terima
jam
kasih banyak,
6.
Mas Santo.
Ya, doakan saya besok lancar pulang.
Thank
PCR
you.
di sini
Semangat.
susah.
Iya.
Di sini PCR susah. Nyari yang
Iya, emang.
selesai 1 hari itu gue cari 2 kali.
Biayanya
Akhirnya
berapa, Mas? Mahal ya, Mas?
dapat harga 790.
Oh my.
Oh, lumayan.
Iya, pokoknya ya apa fit work in time of pandemi challenging lah. Itu Mario mana tuh Mario? Aduh, kita ntar jam 9 masih ada wawancara lagi, jam 9 waktu sini.